Thank you, Sandy. Well, good morning. Thank you again for coming to the symposium. It's a great pleasure for everybody here at the Transverse Myelitis Center to interact with you, because when we are seeing patients, one of our major goals is to educate patients about transverse myelitis and educate patients about what is going on in research, and try to make sure that everybody understands that this is a disease in which there is an effort and trying to find at least some help and in the future some cure. My major goal this morning is to explain what is the meaning of the brain, what is the meaning of the spinal cord, how the brain and the spinal cord work together. And I will try to be very simplistic, and the major message is we want that you understand what is going on in the spinal cord when a patient has transverse myelitis. So it's a difficult challenge, but let me start with some cartoons and saying the brain is probably the most important organ of the body because the brain controls everything. The brains basically generate a lot of information, and at the same time the brain receives a lot of information that is processed by millions and millions of cells in the brain that are called neurons, and those cells are basically the main center of the central nervous system function. That brain basically is connected with every structure in the body, and there are many ways to do that, and one of the ways is that the major control system is at the top, and that's the brain, and then there is a center that is the spinal cord that is communicating constantly with the brain and receiving and sending information from and to every part of the body. So that means that we are able to communicate because our brain is able to generate some words, and at the same time we understand what people is saying because our brain is processing that information. We are able to lift heavy things because the brain generates impulses that are going to our muscles and are sending the information to our muscles that say you need to move and you need to do the work. At the same time, we are receiving a lot of information from different ways. Again, auditory function, visual function are very important. So that work is done by millions and millions of cells, and probably the most important cell is the neuron. And the neuron, again, is a factory. It's a chemical and electrical factory that is working all the time. Even before we are born, those neurons are getting organized to do a quite amazing function that is a function in which chemical activity and electrical activity are combined. So we always compare the brain to the computer, but I will say it's probably to say that people that create computers were copying the brain, because the brain is the most amazing thing in terms of organization. All of the cells, called neurons, are basically very well organized in different areas of the brain. The brain is a very complex structure. You can compare this with a sponge, and this sponge contains all of these cells that are generating electrical activity. These cells are organized predominantly in some structure of the brain that we call gray matter, and the gray matter is here pink, and this is a histological section. And this gray matter basically contains millions of units that are called neurons. And these neurons are organized in the way that they are sending information to other structures inside of the brain and are sending information to other parts of the central nervous system, like the spinal cord and peripheral nerves. So the cell body, or the main center of the cell, is here in the cerebral cortex. But all of these cells send fibers down to the spinal cord. Those fibers are called axons. And these fibers are quite important for brain function because basically it's the wiring system inside of the central nervous system. And this will facilitate communication between cerebral cortex, spinal cord, and other structures in the body. Many times, what we identify as a gray matter is the cerebral cortex. And in this imaging of the brain obtained by MRI, we can see that cerebral cortex here is just outside of the brain. And inside of the brain is the white matter. So here, this is the white matter. And again, this white matter contains millions and millions of fibers that are coming from those neurons and are going to establish communications with different structures of the brain. So this activity is an amazing activity because it's mostly a chemical and electrical activity. So the neuron is making proteins that are called neurotransmitters. And those proteins and chemicals are going to establish a communication with other cells in the body called neurons or muscle cells or any type of cell. And those communications are basically through electrical activity. So the chemicals that the neuron is making here in the cell body, like in the cerebral cortex, are being transported to the end of that axon and are going to produce an electrical stimulation. So this is an amazing process. It's a very complicated process in which there are many proteins and many other type of factors that are involved. The brain is very complex. Let me show you the brain of a rat. Weight is only 10 grams. This is the brain of a monkey. It's only 300 grams. And this is the human brain, that is 1,200 grams. So during the whole process of evolution, what the human brain has gained is cells. Neurons. All of the cells are basically making more function, and that's the reason the human brain is more complex and more capable to do many things in terms of function. So we always talk about neurons. So let me explain what is a neuron. So neuron is a cell, a very specialized cell, that is basically comprised by a cell body in which all proteins are prepared. That's the kitchen of the brain. All the structures are basically produced here, and these proteins are transported to the end of that cell, and this process here is called an axon. This structure can be few millimeters or can be longer than 50 or even more centimeters. So the cell body that is just a microscopical structure is attached with wires, and these wires are called axons. And these axons, again, can go long distances to connect with other cells, other neurons, or other parts of the body. One important portion of this axon, and you are going to hear in the next 3 days a word myelin. One important portion of this axon is myelin. If you take a cord like this microphone cord, so there is a plastic wrapping around that fiber or that wire. In the brain and the nervous system, the myelin is the plastic wrapping around the fiber. And many times when there is multiple sclerosis or when there is some type of immunological attack against the central nervous system or the spinal cord, myelin is one of the areas or one of the regions of the neurons that is being attacked. And many times, the only part of the neuron that is affected is the myelin. But in other processes, the myelin is being attacked, the axon is being attacked, and the cell body is being attacked. So there are many areas of the neuron, there are many parts of the neuron that can be susceptible to specific attacks. But myelin is particularly important because in the case of multiple sclerosis, the immunological process, the immune reactions that occur in those diseases are going to target specifically the myelin. There are other disorders in which the main target is the cell body. For example, in Lou Gehrig disease, the main problem is the cell body of motor neurons in the spinal cord. And for unknown reason, this disease can start a process of degeneration of that cell body. In other diseases, like in peripheral neuropathies, the main problem is either the myelin or the axon. So again, the neuron has a lot of portions that can be affected by different types of disorders. One part that is very important in the structure of the neuron is the myelin, and that myelin is being prepared by oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes are other type of cells in the brain that are making constantly this myelin. So for the survival of the neuron, the maintenance of myelin, oligodendrocytes are extremely important because those are the factories for this plastic wrapping around the axon. Now, how is this work? This is a very complex process in which, again, the cell body is preparing a lot of proteins that are being transported to the end and are activating structures like muscles. So that's the reason you are able to move your arm, because the neuron in the cerebral cortex is making a lot of proteins that are called neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters are going to the end of that neuron and are interacting with structures like the muscle and are producing the movement. So this is a very complex process that takes milliseconds. This is a very fast process. And this is the amazing part of brain function and central nervous system function. This is a matter of milliseconds. When your brain says, move your hand, that takes milliseconds to produce all of these electrical impulses and stimulate the muscle. Now, unfortunately, there are many factors that can affect the function of that neuron. I will focus mostly in immunological problems because that is one of the most frequent factors that produce transverse myelitis. And let me explain briefly what happened with some parts of the body of this neuron. Again, the neuron is comprised by the cell body, the axon, and the myelin. When there is an infection or there is an immunological attack, there are inflammatory cells that are called lymphocytes or leukocytes. And these white cells from the bloodstream can come to the brain or spinal cord and produce an immune attack against the cell body, or an immune attack against the myelin, or an immune attack against the axon. And this process can involve other type of factors. For example, we know that not only cells, inflammatory cells, can produce attacks against this part of the neuron. We know, for example, there are other cells in the brain that are called microglia, other cells in the bloodstream that are called macrophages that can migrate into the spinal cord and produce immunological attacks against any of these components of the neuron. So immunoglobulins that are basically other type of immunological factors in the bloodstream can also produce this type of immune attack. So the neuron is susceptible to this type of attacks because it's a very long structure. I mean, if you can imagine, the neurons that control your hand movement are here. So there is a connection between your brain and your hand. So there is almost 1 or more meter of distance in which this structure is susceptible to this type of attacks. There is another problem that I didn't mention here too much because other speakers are going to talk about that, and is the possibility of strokes in the spinal cord. So what happens is, when there is no blood supply in the spinal cord, this neuron is going to suffer because there is no oxygen. The neuron is going to have a lot of stress and eventually is going to stop the production of proteins to maintain the survival of that neuron. So a stroke or lack of blood supply to the spinal cord can produce an attack against neurons. Let me talk a little bit more about these neurons. I mentioned that this is an electrical and chemical factory, and there is a lot of communication and connections between these neurons and other neurons in the cerebral cortex or in the spinal cord, and that communication is through different fibers that are surrounding the cell body. And the long axon, the long process, is basically the main highway that facilitates communication between the cell body and the terminal nerve structure. Now, these neurons are not working alone. These neurons need other cells to be able to maintain a 24 hours function. And those cells are called glial cells. And let me explain about which glial cells are important in brain function. Probably one of the most important ones are astrocytes. And these are cells that support the neuronal function, but also facilitate a communication between the bloodstream. Remember, the bloodstream is very important for brain function and spinal cord function because all nutrients are coming to the brain through the bloodstream. So the bloodstream facilitates the nutrients to these neuronal components, and astrocytes are facilitating and at the same time are regulating that communication. The other cell that I mentioned before is another glial cell, is the oligodendrocyte. Again, the oligodendrocyte is the cell, is the factory for myelin. So all the structure of the brain, all the structure of the spinal cord contain a lot of these cells because these cells are fundamental for the neuronal function because the production of myelin. Now, let's focus a little bit on the spinal cord. I mentioned before, the spinal cord is the long CNS structure, central nervous system structure, that is inside of the spinal column. This spinal cord is like a tube. It's quite elongated and is basically communicating with all parts, all regions of the brain. This is a very old diagram. This is the brain. This is the spinal cord. And what I'm trying to say here is that this spinal cord is the main highway that facilitates communication between the periphery, arms, legs, nerves, skin, and the brain. Many receptors for pain, many receptors for different type of stimulations that are on the skin are communicated with the spinal cord through these very fine structures that are called peripheral nerves. And you have peripheral nerves everywhere. And these peripheral nerves basically are the bridges between the skin or the periphery and the spinal cord. So there is a constant communication with the spinal cord and eventually with the brain by using all of these small fibers that are in the periphery. At the same time, the brain is sending a lot of information downstream. This information is coming from the cerebral cortex, as we said before, and this information is coming down to the spinal cord and is getting organized in the spinal cord to facilitate a lot of function, not necessarily motor function, but different type of function like sensory function, etc. So what I'm trying to do in the next few minutes is to review more in detail what happened in the spinal cord. All right, so we saw the brain. In the brain, we have the gray matter, the white matter. The gray matter in the brain is the cerebral cortex that contains millions of neurons. The white matter in the brain is the group of axons that are coming down or coming up to communicate with the neurons. The spinal cord is also organized in gray matter and white matter, but there is a little bit of difference. If you remember, in the brain, the gray matter was outside. In the spinal cord, the gray matter is inside. That means that inside of the gray matter, we have millions of neurons. If this is the anterior portion of the spinal cord, this is the posterior portion. So many of the neurons in the anterior portion of the gray matter here in the spinal cord, millions of these neurons have motor activity. So those are the neurons that are going to tell the arm or the leg to move. On the other part of the gray matter in the spinal cord, the posterior region, we have other group of neurons that are not necessarily motor neurons. These are the neurons that are involved in sensory or sensorial function. So here we have neurons that receive information from the periphery. So if we come back to this diagram, many of these connections through peripheral nerves are coming to this region that is the posterior region of the gray matter here. So the outside portion of the spinal cord is the white matter. So if you remember, white matter contains the wiring for communication between brain and other structures, or vice versa, other structures and brain. So in the spinal cord, we have this white matter outside, and this white matter carries information that is coming from the brain down, or is coming from the periphery up to the brain. And again, all of this function is mediated through electrical and chemical activity of the neurons. So this is the summary of our spinal cord and how our spinal cord is organized. So we have in the gray matter centers that deal with outflow function, in this case motor function, and this is the anterior region of the gray matter that is called anterior horn. And we have the posterior horn of the gray matter that is also called the dorsal horn. So these two areas of the gray matter work, one with sensation and the other one with motor function. Now, if you remember, our spinal cord is extremely well organized. So when some type of infection, some type of vascular problem, or some type of injury affect the spinal cord, we may be affecting one portion of the spinal cord, or we may be affecting the entire spinal cord. And that will decide what is the magnitude of neurological problems that a patient with a spinal cord disease is going to have. Okay? Let me explain about this structure. So gray matter is basically accumulation of neurons, neurons that deal with motor function, in this case the neurons that are localized in the anterior portion of the gray matter in the spinal cord, and again the posterior neurons in the gray matter are dealing with sensation. But what about the white matter? Again, the white matter is very well organized. So there is a very good organization of the pathways that are coming down. For example, in the lateral portion of the spinal cord, we have highway of motor function coming from the brain to the spinal cord. This highway is called corticospinal tract, and the name cortico is because it's connecting the cortex with the spinal cord. And these are the major tracts that carries information for motor function. So we always say that when there is involvement of the lateral portion of the spinal cord, that will produce damage of that communication. In other words, that is going to produce damage of motor function. But there is other type of information that is going upstairs to the brain. And those are basically pathways or highways that we call are ascending highways. These ascending highways always carry information from the periphery to the brain or other parts of the central nervous system. In the white matter, this information, again, is carried by axons that are many times very well myelinated. So myelin is a very good thing for the fiber because myelin facilitates a very good communication between the cell body and the N-terminal portion of the neuron. So let's talk about sensory function. So your finger. So your finger is communicated with the spinal cord, and the communication is through peripheral nerves. So remember, these wires are communicating receptors that you have in your finger with the peripheral nerve, and that peripheral nerve is going to end in one portion of the peripheral nervous system that is called dorsal root ganglia, that is accumulation of neurons. So neurons here are the first stop of the sensor information. So every time that you touch something, the network consists in receptors that you have here in your finger that are going to the dorsal root ganglia where there are neurons that establish communication with the spinal cord. And if you remember from my previous slide, this communication, that is sensory communication, is coming to the posterior gray matter in the spinal cord. Let's remind about that. This is the posterior region in the spinal cord gray matter. So when you have this communication, this spinal cord is going to tell the brain, okay, my finger is detecting some signals, and that signal is going upstairs to the brain and establishing connections with other portion of the brain and portion of the cerebral cortex. So this is a very well-organized communication. This is a network. And this network, again, is working in milliseconds, and is working through, is working by using many chemicals and many electrical activities. When we disturb this function, what we have is pain, lack of sensation, abnormal sensation, or lack of balance. And this is interesting because many patients with transverse myelitis always complain about lack of balance. There is no weakness, but the lack of balance means that the central nervous system is unable to receive communication from the periphery, in this case, your legs, and this communication is disrupted because something happened in the spinal cord. So the brain never gets the information. And that's the reason many patients with transverse myelitis experience problems with lack of balance, not necessarily because they are weak, but because the communication between the periphery and the brain is completely disrupted because something happened in the spinal cord. And we will touch that a little bit later. Another major symptom in transverse myelitis is pain. And this is one of the most excruciating situations for our patients. So pain is originated either in the periphery or is originated here in the spinal cord. And in patients with transverse myelitis, we believe that the main center of pain activity is in the spinal cord. It's not necessarily in the periphery. Many patients complain about burning sensation in their feet and other problems. And many times the problem is not in their feet. The problem is in the spinal cord that is undergoing inflammation or abnormal electrical activity, and that is firing constantly, and that's the reason patients have pain. One thing that is very interesting is when there is a damage or injury in the spinal cord, your body tries to regenerate, and many times that process of regeneration is inducing abnormal electrical activity. And that abnormal electrical activity, unfortunately, is going to produce pain. And in many ways, pain in patients with transverse myelitis is a bad thing to have, but in other ways, is a reminder that something is going on in the spinal cord, and perhaps there is some type of regenerative activity in the spinal cord that is inducing that pain. Let's talk about motor function. So motor function is what is coming from the brain to the spinal cord. And that function is very well localized in a portion of the cerebral cortex that is called motor cortex. And that information is coming down in two different highways. The main highway is like Highway 95. It's a big one with a lot of traffic, and that is communicating the brain on one side with the spinal cord on the other side. So that is very interesting because many times we understand the function in the brain, like your right brain is moving your left part of the body, and your left brain is moving the right part of the body. And that happened because this highway crossed to the other side in one portion of the brain that is called brainstem. But all of this function, again, is going to communicate this cortex with the spinal cord, and this spinal cord with muscles and other effectors of movement. When this communication is disrupted because there is transverse myelitis, the consequence is weakness, or the extreme of weakness that is called paralysis. Or when there is dysfunction in this communication, the other consequence is stiffness, something that we call in medical terms spasticity. And these problems are very frequent when there is a disruption of the motor function. Let me give you some examples, because many times when patients come to our clinic, they ask, why do I have weakness and I don't have sensory loss? Or the other way, why do I have sensory loss and I don't have weakness? So what I will try to communicate you in the next few minutes is why that happened. That happened because the spinal cord is very well organized. We mentioned before that the main highway coming from the motor function is here in the lateral portion of the spinal cord. But there are other highways that are coming from the periphery in the lateral portion of the spinal cord. And in the posterior region, there is a major highway that is carrying information from your legs and your arms to the brain. When we have areas of damage in those specific regions of the brain, but there is no involvement of the gray matter, many times we have this type of damage that produce either paralysis, increase in spasticity, because the highway from the brain, the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord is being affected. But at the same time, the communication between the periphery and the brain is disrupted, and that is the reason there are lack of sensation, there are problems with sensory abnormalities, and there are problems with lack of balance that in medical terms is called ataxia. Why? Because number one, the motor communication is disrupted, and number two, because the sensory communication is also disrupted. Fortunately, many times the gray matter is preserved, and that will allow a process of regeneration in some patients and some cases, but that is not necessarily the situation every time. There are some conditions that affect exclusively the motor highways. In this case, the only symptom that the patient is going to experience is paralysis or spasticity. There are other problems in which the only area of the spinal cord that is affected is the posterior region. And these are the patients that are always complaining about lack of balance. They are not able to walk, not because they are weak, but because they are not able to coordinate movement, and there is an absolute lack of communication between the legs and the sensory system that is necessary to tell the body where the legs are located. Another example is a bad situation that happens sometimes when the gray matter and the white matter are affected simultaneously. And these are the catastrophic situations that we have in some patients with transverse myelitis, in which there is no motor function, there is complete paralysis, there is spasticity, and this, unfortunately, is one of the extreme cases of attacks against the spinal cord, because in many cases, the destruction of the gray matter here is an irreversible process, because the neurons that are dying are not going to be recovered by the body. There is combination of problems. There are combination of problems, for example, when the motor highway is associated with destruction of the sensory highway. So in those patients, for example, there is disruption not only of sensation, but there is also a significant paralysis or weakness. And there are other conditions that affect the central portion of the spinal cord, and in that way can affect predominantly the gray matter. And this is one of the most frequent examples of injury that happen in transverse myelitis. Multiple sclerosis, for example, produce an attack against the white matter. But in many patients with transverse myelitis, the attack is not in the white matter. It's in the central portion of the spinal cord, and that's the reason there is a combination of motor dysfunction with sensory dysfunction. And in some few cases of patients, there are attacks exclusively against gray matter portion that is dealing with sensory information. And these are the patients that are dealing with pain all the time or dealing with sensory problems all the time. And in these cases, these patients need a lot of medications to control the sensory symptomatology. So what I can conclude here is that the spinal cord is a very well-organized structure. It's the main way in which the brain is communicating with the periphery. And in that way, many areas of the spinal cord are going to be affected if there is a massive attack against the spinal cord. Fortunately, many patients with transverse myelitis do not experience a full attack. They experience only a localized attack against the spinal cord. And that is what I explained before. Based in the location or topography of that attack, we are going to have the neurological symptoms. And that's the reason there is a lot of heterogeneity in the symptomatology of patients experiencing attacks by transverse myelitis. There are different symptoms, there are different profiles of pain, there are different profiles of motor dysfunction, and the explanation is the organization of the spinal cord. So I hope that at least I provided this primer of neuroanatomy with my hope that in the next few lectures you will understand more and more what is the meaning of transverse myelitis and how the immune system affects the spinal cord. And